Robert Lyon was born on December 30th, 1812, in Inverurie, Scotland, to George Lyon and Elspeth Philip Lyon. He immigrated to Canada with his family in 1829. John Wilson was born on February 5th, 1807, in Paisley, Renfrewshire, Scotland, and moved to Perth, Upper Canada, with his family around 1823. Both Lyon and Wilson studied law under the guidance of prominent lawyers in Perth. If a skilled lawyer is defined by their arguments, then Perth was fortunate to have three of the finest, as they often engaged in heated debates. Daniel McMartin, James Bolton, and Thomas Radenhurst were the first lawyers in Perth, all having studied under Dr. John Strahan before establishing their practices in the early 1820s. Bolton arrived in 1823, McMartin followed shortly after, and Radenhurst came in 1824. Bolton and McMartin frequently clashed. Bolton considered himself of a higher social standing than McMartin, who believed that a person's worth was determined by their hard work and actions rather than their birth status. Despite their differences, both shared a strong disdain for Radenhurst, a reformer whose radical ideas they opposed. Their disputes escalated beyond words, leading to physical altercations, including Bolton horsewhipping McMartin in 1831. They even challenged each other to duels. McMartin challenged Bolton in 1827, and in 1830, Radenhurst and Bolton agreed to duel. However, none of the duels ever occurred. Bolton expressed the belief that a duel could uphold one's reputation, even if it could never restore it once tarnished. John Wilson and Robert Lyon found themselves in a tumultuous situation. John Wilson became the law clerk for James Bolton and lived with the Bolton family, while Robert Lyon, a relative of Mrs. Radenhurst, came to study under Thomas Radenhurst. According to the story, Wilson and Lyon were sent to Bytown on business by their employers. There, Wilson allegedly overheard Lyon making a derogatory comment about a Miss Elizabeth Hughes, suggesting that she had allowed young men to indulge in little freedoms that were unbecoming. While in Bytown, Wilson wrote to Mrs. Bolton in Perth, including this information. The news spread quickly, and eventually rumors about Lyon's remark regarding Miss Hughes's character circulated widely. Accounts of the events leading up to the duel differ. Some suggest that Henry Lallièvre, a friend of Lyon, had feelings for Miss Hughes, but she was disinterested, leading him to blame John Wilson. Others claim that Robert Lyon had feelings for Miss Hughes, and when she learned of his supposed remarks, she rejected him, prompting him to blame Wilson for the situation. This led to a confrontation in which Lyon slapped Wilson in front of the courthouse. After some reflection and discussion, Wilson challenged Lyon to a duel, which Lyon accepted. It is said that Lyon's friend, Henry Lallièvre, known for his bold and unscrupulous disposition, encouraged him to accept the challenge. The prevailing atmosphere, influenced by the actions and opinions of Bolton and Radenhurst, also contributed to their decision to duel. Lyon chose Lallièvre as his second, while Wilson selected Simon Fraser Robertson. At dawn on June 13th, 1833, the two men quietly left town for the duel. Following the customs of dueling, a surgeon, Mr. Reed, accompanied them to either tend to the wounded or pronounce the deceased. The group made their way to a clearing east of town near what is now Last Duel Park. The two young men stood about 60 feet apart, wearing black trousers and baring their torsos. As they leveled their dueling pistols, a loud crack echoed through the clearing as both pistols discharged simultaneously. A cloud of smoke momentarily obscured them, but when it cleared, both were still standing. Relief washed over them. The deed was done, and their honor had been upheld. Neither had truly wanted the duel, but recent events had inevitably led to this confrontation. However, 1 second called out, "Load up again," arguing passionately that their honor would remain unsatisfied until the duel produced a definitive outcome. The young duelists were caught by fate as their pistols were reloaded, and they returned to their positions. Once again, they turned sideways to face each other, aimed their pistols, and fired in unison. This time, however, one of the men spun partway around, his hands raised in the air, before collapsing, dead by the time he hit the ground. The bullet had struck his heart, and he fell lifeless on the spot at just 19 years old. Lallièvre fled the scene, while Wilson and Robertson surrendered to the authorities. The lifeless body of Robert Lyon was taken back to the Radenhurst residence. The following day, Reverend William Bell reported that Radenhurst, driven to madness by alcohol, stormed over to Bolton's house with a pistol, intent on shooting him. Fortunately for Bolton, Radenhurst was unable to find him. Later that year, Bolton was driven out of Perth due to the many enemies he had made. Wilson spent 3 months in the Perth jail awaiting his trial in Brockville. Acting as his own lawyer, his passionate defense led to his acquittal. As for the young lady, Miss Elizabeth Hughes, who was at the center of the disputes that sparked the duel, she later became Mrs. John Wilson. Haigh battered to death or shot his victims and disposed of their bodies using sulfuric acid before forging their signatures so he could sell their possessions and collect large sums of money. His actions were the subject of the television film A is for Acid. John Haigh was born in Stamford, Lincolnshire, and raised in the village of Outwood, West Riding of Yorkshire. His parents were engineer John Robert Haigh and his wife Emily, members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative Protestant sect. He was an only child. Haigh later claimed that he suffered from recurring religious nightmares in his childhood. He developed great proficiency at the piano, which he learned at home. He was fond of classical music and often attended concerts. Haigh won a scholarship to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School, Wakefield, then to Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy. After school, he was apprenticed to a firm of motor engineers. After a year, he left that job and took jobs in insurance and advertising. Age 21, he was dismissed after being suspected of stealing from a cash box. After being fired, he moved on to forging car documents. On the 6th of July, 1934, Haigh married 23-year-old Beatrice Betty Hamer. The marriage soon disintegrated. The same year that Haigh was jailed for fraud, Betty gave birth to a baby girl while he was in prison, and she placed the baby for adoption and left Haigh. Haigh's family ostracized him from then onwards. Haigh moved to London in 1936 and became chauffeur to William McSwan, a wealthy owner of amusement arcades. He also maintained McSwan's amusement machines. Thereafter, he pretended to be a solicitor named William Cato Adamson, with offices in Chancery Lane, London, Guildford, Surrey, and Hastings, Sussex. He sold fraudulent stock shares, purportedly from the estates of his deceased clients, at below-market rates. His scam was uncovered by someone who noticed he had misspelled Guildford as Guilford on his letterhead. Haigh received a 4-year prison sentence for fraud. He was released just after the start of the Second World War. He continued as a fraudster and was sentenced to several further terms of imprisonment. Regretting that he had left victims alive to accuse him, he became intrigued by French murderer Georges-Alexandre Sarret, who had disposed of bodies using sulfuric acid. Haigh experimented with field mice and found that it took only 30 minutes for the body to dissolve. Haigh was freed from prison in 1943 and became an accountant with an engineering firm. Soon after, by chance, he encountered his former employer William McSwan in a Kensington pub. McSwan introduced Haigh to his parents, Donald and Amy. McSwan worked for them by collecting rents on their London properties, and Haigh became envious of his lifestyle. On the 6th of September 1944, McSwan disappeared. Haigh later admitted he had lured McSwan into a basement on Gloucester Road, hit him over the head with a lead pipe, and then put his body in a 40 imperial gallon drum with concentrated sulfuric acid. 2 days later, finding that McSwan's body had mostly dissolved, Haigh emptied the drum into a manhole. He told McSwan's parents that their son had gone into hiding in Scotland to avoid being called up for military service. Haigh then began living in McSwan's house and collecting rent for McSwan's parents. They became curious as to why their son had not returned, as the war was coming to an end. On the 2nd of July, 1945, he lured them to Gloucester Road by telling them their son was back from Scotland for a surprise visit. There he killed them with blows to the head and disposed of them. Haigh then stole McSwan's pension checks and sold his parents' properties for around £8,000 and moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington. Haigh was a gambler. By 1947, he was running short of money. To solve his financial troubles, he found another couple to kill and rob, Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose. After feigning interest in a house that they were selling, he was invited to the Hendersons' flat by Rose to play the piano for their housewarming party. While at the flat, Haigh stole Archibald Henderson's revolver, planning to use it in his next crime. Renting a small workshop at 2 Leopold Road, Crawley, West Sussex, He moved acid and drums there from Gloucester Road. Haigh was also known to have stayed at Crawley's Hotel, the George, on several occasions. On the 12th of February 1948, he drove Archibald Henderson to his workshop on the pretext of showing him an invention. When they arrived, Haigh shot Henderson in the head with the stolen revolver. Haigh then lured Rose Henderson to the workshop, claiming that her husband had fallen ill, and he shot her as well. After disposing of the Hendersons' bodies in oil drums filled with acid, he forged a letter with their signatures and sold all of their possessions for £8,000, except for their car and dog, which he kept. Haigh's next and last victim was Olive Duran Deacon, 69, the wealthy widow of solicitor John Duran Deacon and a fellow resident at the Onslow Court Hotel. Haigh by then was calling himself an engineer, and he heard Olive talk to her friends about her idea for artificial fingernails. He invited her down to the Leopold Road workshop on the 18th of February 1949, and once inside, he shot her in the back of the neck with the .38 caliber Webley revolver that he had stolen from Archibald Henderson, stripped her of her valuables, including a Persian lamb coat, and put her into the acid bath. 2 days later, Duran Deacon's friend, Constance Lane, reported her missing. Detectives soon discovered Haigh's record of theft and fraud and searched the workshop. Police found Haigh's attaché case containing a dry cleaner's receipt for Olive Duran Deacon's coat and also papers referring to the Hendersons and McSwans. The workshop in Sussex, rented by Haigh, did not contain a floor drain, unlike the workshop he had rented at Gloucester Road in London. He therefore disposed of the remains by pouring out the container on a rubble pile at the back of the property. Investigation of the area by pathologist Keith Simpson revealed 28 pounds, 13 kilograms, of human body fat, part of a human foot, human gallstones, and part of a denture, which was later identified by Olive Duran Deacon's dentist during the trial. Haigh asked Detective Inspector Albert Webb during questioning, "Tell me frankly, what are the chances of anybody being released from Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital?" The inspector said that he could not discuss that sort of thing, so Haigh replied, "Well, if I told you the truth, you would not believe me. It sounds too fantastic to believe." Haigh then confessed that he had killed Duran Deacon, the McSwans, and the Hendersons, as well as 3 other people, a young man called Max, a girl from Eastbourne, and a woman from Hammersmith. These claims could not be substantiated. Haigh's trial was held at Lewes. Assize's evidence from the trial is now in the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard. Haigh pleaded insanity, claiming that he had drunk the blood of his victims. He said he had dreams dominated by blood as a young boy. When he was involved in a car accident in March 1944, his dream returned to him. "I saw before me a forest of crucifixes which gradually turned into trees. At first there appeared to be dew or rain, dripping from the branches, but as I approached I realized it was blood. The whole forest began to writhe and the trees, dark and erect, to ooze blood. A man went from each tree catching the blood. When the cup was full, he approached me. 'Drink,' he said, but I was unable to move." The Attorney General, Sir Hartley Shawcross, KC, later Lord Shawcross, led for the prosecution and urged the jury to reject Haigh's defense of insanity because he had acted with malice aforethought. Sir David Maxwell. Fife KC, defending, called many witnesses to attest to Haig's mental state, including Henry Yellowlees, who claimed Haigh had a paranoid constitution, adding, "The absolute callous, cheerful, bland, and almost friendly indifference of the accused to the crimes which he freely admits having committed is unique in my experience." Haigh apparently had believed, mistakenly, that if the bodies of his victims could not be found, a murder conviction would not be possible. It took only minutes for the jury to find him guilty. Mr. Justice Humphreys sentenced him to death. On the 10th of August, 1949, Haigh was hanged by executioner Albert Pierrepoint. The case was one of the post-1945 cases which gained considerable coverage in the newspapers, even though Haigh's guilt was not questioned. The editor of the Daily Mirror, Sylvester Ballam, was sentenced to a 3-month prison term for contempt of court for describing Haigh as a murderer, while the trial was still underway.